Anyway, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is talk three of Roadblocks, the Republic, and today is the Alien and Sedition Acts. And I'm going to reference 1918 here too with the Sedition Act, going back to 1798. But the fact of the matter is here, and today is President's Day.
Yes.
You want to bring that up. And I gave a talk this morning on George Washington. And I didn't go into his life. I mean, you can find that any place. But the effect of his presidency itself. And that has a bearing. And that has a bearing on this talk because he is the first president. He is the first president. And, okay, he was one of the founders. He does carry baggage. He was a big landowner. He had slaves. I get that one. But let's understand something. This country was, in a way, blessed that he was what he was. And the reason I say that is after the uprisings in the Continental Army. I went into that. That was the first talk. The Newburgh incident, March 15, 1783. And he had to put down the uprisings in the Continental Army. The country is not on good footing at this point. We're not even a country yet, and it's not even on good footing. And you have many uprisings and mutinies in the Army. They were promised to be paid. Where's that money going to come from? The soldiers themselves were promised new uniforms. Where is that coming from? They were promised food. That wasn't a constant here. They had a problem being fed. In fact, many of the farmers here, sprinkled through the colonies, their army, the Continental Army, is parked or bivouacked next to their army and next to their farm, and they know what's going to happen. They know the midnight requisitions, as it used to be called. You're missing a cow, you're missing a couple of pigs, you're missing a few chickens, but these guys got to eat. It's nice to be patriotic, but I got to eat here. But where's the money coming from? And it wasn't unusual, the late 1770s, getting into 1780, 1781, to find that Continental soldiers, 3, 4, or 5 of them, were sharing the same coat in the winter. How can you have an army like this? You don't think you're not going to get complaints here? And then there were the officers. Interesting, we're forming a country here, and what are some of them thinking? We're going to have an army. I have a job. I'm an officer. I'm going to have a job. However, you got to watch because officers can become a class. And that can be a problem with some countries. Take a look at Egypt. You don't think the officer class there doesn't run the country? Yeah, it does.
Iran?
Yeah, it does. To a certain extent, the Revolutionary Guard, if you want to use that one. And so when you see, Nasser, Saddam, Mubarak, and now who? Sisi now? They're all part of that army class, the military class. They're all part of this. That is a problem for some countries. We never had that problem, did we? Until maybe now. Because take a look at what's going on with many of the officers here. That's nice that a 1, 2, 3, 4 star gets a decent pension from you for their service. But at the same time, maybe they get that revolving door going. I leave the Army and I join Boeing, or I go to Lockheed, or I go to Raytheon, or something like that. It's a revolving door here. That's what it is. Yes. Why would you need a president with military experience? That would be the question, right? At that point? Well, of course they do. Of course they do. I mean, keep in mind here the change in your government. Keep in mind the change in your government since the last World War II president, George Bush Sr.
Yes.
And then take a look at your Congress. Are there any World War II vets in Congress anymore? They came up in that, and this gets back to what George Washington's going to warn about, and I'm going to get into that. This gets back into that, even after the war here, even after the war in 45, many of your members of Congress had been veterans. Democrat or Republican in the 40s, 50s, going into the 60s, even the 70s here, compromise. What was good for the country, compromise. What happened to that? But back then, during the war, everyone was on the same page. You gave up your sugar, your meat, your cheese, your salt, whatever. Gasoline was rationed. You had the sticker on your window here. But everyone was on the same page. If you weren't in a uniform, you were in a factory working, your loved one was in a factory working for you. That happen anymore? That's a problem. I find that an issue. And so when you take a look here at what's going on back in 1780, the 1780s into the 1790s here, you're putting together a country, but George Washington will be your president. And he didn't want to be. I want to go home. No, you got to stick around. Well, who else is going to be president? He is. How many can say they got every electoral vote necessary? He didn't. I mean, he got them all. Well, who's going to run against him? That's the thing. No, you got to stick around. He does stick around. He does stick around. After the first term, I want to go home. No, you got to stick around. After the second term, I'm leaving. Well, when you had George Washington as your president, again, I'll give you that. He was a landowner, had slaves. Okay, that's fine. That's part of that discussion. Everybody, I don't care who they are, carries baggage.
Right.
That's part of the human condition, isn't it?
Like all of us.
Okay, right. And so, but I guess it depends on your value system, how you view that baggage. But let's understand something. At the time they're forming a country, and George Washington's going to warn about this. You see in the Constitution the 3/5 compromise.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so, you have 650,000 blacks here as slaves, and yet Southerners, to get the Southerners on board here, they gave them two things in the end. Well, we're going to move the capital, because Southerners complained, we're going to move the capital from Philadelphia and New York to the banks of the Potomac. And you know where that's going to eventually become? Washington, D.C., right? Okay, but then again, there's still more people up north than there were down south. So, okay, they can count out of 650,000, the 3/5 compromise. You're talking what? Maybe you count 416,000 of blacks who can't vote as people towards representation in Congress. That's really what you're talking about here. That's what you're talking about. And so, because if you threw the crown out of here, the last thing we need is a counter-revolution by the planters to form their own country. No, let's get them on board here. And so when you do that, at the same time, what you're seeing develop here right at the beginning, that Jeffersonian idea of the agrarian as the salt of the earth, and this burgeoning Hamiltonian notion of industrialization/finance. With the Jefferson, and keep in mind, Jefferson will be the Secretary of the State, and Hamilton will control the money. Yet, they are going to be the two primary advisors to George Washington. And these two are the poster child expressions of two doctrines that are competing in the end to be that underlying essence of rule. In other words, they both agree to what they're going to call a republic with its checks and balances. They both agree on that. Jefferson, though, believes that the people who dig in the dirt, the farmer, the agrarian as the salt of the earth, is the best protector of Republican, elective, limited government. That's what they're putting in, limited government. Of course, there's only 3 million people. You don't have 335 million. That's what they're doing here. Hamilton, on the other hand, doesn't believe in this solely. He believes, yes, that this notion of only the ditch digger or the farmer is the salt of the earth and therefore the best protector of Republican government. He sees it different. He understands, I think, better than Jefferson does, although that can be opened up to debate. He understands what's coming here. The Industrial Revolution, it's already well on the way. Capitalism, finance. How are you going to straighten out the country's finances when it's virtually broke? That's the problem. That's been the problem. However, they both understand something here. You know, I'm sure you got this too. This idea, well, the founders and the revolutionaries, you know, liberty and freedom and all that other stuff. Let's understand something. Your revolution was fought for one big thing here: land. Land is a determinant of power. And the real reason you're going to have a revolution here is economic liberty. If I can have land, I can have what I want. And so when the British Crown stopped the colonists from grabbing land, and you're a poor white and you can't make it in one of the villages or towns or few cities we got, you don't think you're not going to be angry here? Let's be real. Revolution. It worked in 1776. But at the same time here, we don't need revolution. We got to tamp it down. So you have a constitution and you have a Bill of Rights. And interestingly enough, we have to have, yes, you're going to get a ruling clique running the country. It's generally the landed interest, but you throw bones to the people. How about they elect their local representative every 2 years? And how about the Senate? Okay, we have two chambers in the House, in Congress, the legislative branch, but you didn't vote for your senators then. But you voted for your state legislators who apply your senators. That was part of those checks and balances, part of this arrangement of government. And yet at the same time, you are seeing the Jeffersonian notion and the Hamiltonian notion beginning to vie here for dominance. And George Washington's going to spend half his 2 terms as a referee. Now, interestingly enough, you know, as we go from 1788 to 1796, you're seeing something that starts up here a year after, really, after Washington's president, the French Revolution. And now the French helped us against the British. You also have that 1778 agreement here with George Washington, but Ben Franklin helped negotiate that the French would help us throw the British out of here. We'd also open up French trade between the two countries. But if France and Britain go to war, guess what? We're going to help them, right? You know what's interesting about that one? In 1919, you know, with the Versailles Treaty that Wilson's going to sign, and yet if he signs that treaty, doesn't the Senate have to ratify same for it to take effect here? Of course they do. And are they going to? No, they won't. But at the same time here, you know what Georges Clemenceau was asking? He was also asking for a separate treaty between France, Britain, and the United States to act as a check on Germany in case there's resurging German power. And Wilson's going to say, the Senate's not going to ratify that. Georges Clemenceau is looking to have his cake and eat it too. That's what he's doing. And yet, you know, that so-called treaty we have with the French, when the French Revolution starts in 1789, and in 1792, the Great French War starts, the French Revolutionary Wars, when those monarchs are looking to kill that revolution in the womb. What do you think the French are thinking with the 1778 treaty that we had? Isn't America going to help? And what is George Washington going to say in his farewell address? Avoid entangling alliances. Because if you have a military alliance with another country, it could suborn the Constitution and representative government here. Because if you have an alliance, doesn't that obligate you to answer the call? I'm having problems here, give me a hand. Well, it does say in the Constitution, the president can't take us to war. Who has war-making power, according to the Constitution?
Congress.
Congress. Why is that? Because you elect these people in the end. You have to rein in a leader who thinks, because I'm commander-in-chief, I have unlimited power. That's not how the country was supposed to be formed. Yes, well, Roosevelt had to go before Congress and ask, and he got it. Of course, you don't think he wasn't going to get that? It's almost unanimous, and he got it. Yes. I mean, keep in mind. I mean, you're telling people in 13 separate colonies here. And again, I asked that question. What does somebody in South Carolina have with something in common with somebody in Massachusetts?
But
That really, that three-fifths compromise really won't matter until 1865, when slavery is over, and the Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th and the 14th Amendments here, that, you know, people are citizenry, and that leads to the 15th, where the black man will get the right to vote in 1870.
But
What do you think Republicans are thinking? Well, now we can get these black men all to join the Republican Party and keep the South in line. But blacks are considered property.
Yeah.
So, what's the definition as far as taxes go?
Yeah.
But back here, though, back with Washington as president, you are seeing here this warning coming out of his farewell address. Beware of entangling alliances. It would suborn the Constitution. And he'll also warn of something else, because he could see this coming between the Jeffersonian notion of limited representative elective government and the Hamiltonian notion of government, you know, with the Industrial Revolution, finance, industrialization. He can see two camps developing here. And again, he's going to warn in his farewell address, beware of parties. Parties breed factionalism. And you will always see in parties people who will be more aligned with the party precepts as opposed to a nation. You don't see that?
Of course.
Interesting here what he's warning about. And he also warned against an over-bloated military. He thought that would be a threat to the republic, which is why they went with the militia system controlled by governors back then. And so when you read that end of his farewell address, and then read what Eisenhower is saying in 1961, remember that one? Beware the military-industrial complex. You don't think these two men don't see this? They were both generals and they were both presidents. You don't think they don't know that? They don't understand this? And so even prior to Washington finally saying, I'm out of here, I need to go home, you will see the development of the Jeffersonians, the Democrats/Republicans, and then the other side, which is the Federalists, who believe in a stronger central government. And after Washington is out, you will see here the next president who will win the election will be John Adams, a Federalist. Now, some of the business interests wanted to see Thomas Pinckney be the vice president. That won't, because they thought he was pliable. Hamilton, by the way, is pulling a lot of the strings in the background, but he won't run for president, and he won't run for vice president. However, they upset the apple cart's going to be upset here because Thomas Jefferson gets the second most electoral votes, and the way the country was then, the one who got the most electoral votes becomes president. The one who gets the second most electoral votes becomes
Vice President.
Vice President. Now you've got a Federalist as president, and you've got a Democrat Republican as vice president. Now what do you do? One? However, they admire each other. They also admire each other's skill with the written word. Although Adams was one of those that pushed Jefferson to be the final author of the Declaration of Independence, because he thought at one point here that really Jefferson was that aficionado with the English language. Although don't sell any of these other guys short. They knew how to use the pen. They really did. And so, but they both share one thing in common, besides being good writers. They don't have much of a like for Alexander Hamilton. I find that interesting because in the 1800 election, Adams only going to serve one term. In the 1800 election, Jefferson, and Aaron Burr don't have enough electoral votes. And so what happens is what's supposed to happen. The top three vote getters, even, if nobody has the required electoral votes, the election gets thrown back into the House. And so it's going to be between Jefferson and Burr. They both come from the same party, by the way, Democrat, Republican. And so, some people think, oh my God, that the big states will dominate this, right? You know, the states aren't cookie cutter. They all have 2 senators, but depending on the size of the state and how many people, one state could have more representatives than another, which gives them more electoral votes. Doesn't matter when it gets to this level. If it goes to the House, no matter how big or how small a state is, 1 vote each. 1 vote, that's it. So even in today, Connecticut can compete against California. Wow, get a load of that concept. That's a real essence of the Electoral College. That's how it was supposed to work. And keep in mind, they're going to go through in 1800, 36 roll call votes until Jefferson wins. Even Alexander Hamilton was running around trying to get, you don't want to vote for Burr, you want to vote for Jefferson.
That's why I got chopped.
Well, and they didn't quite agree politically, Jefferson and Hamilton, but both again had, no, we don't want Burr. And so, Jefferson here will get the nod. Interesting what you're seeing develop. But at the same time here, you are seeing the French Revolution have a marked influence here. Democrat Republicans were considered aficionados of the French, while the Hamiltonian notion was favor the British. Favor the British. And Hamilton did believe in that stratified society of the English. Well, he wrote that, all societies divide themselves into the few and the many. First there's the rich and the well-born, then the mass. The mass are too tempestuous and unpredictable. They can't rule. So leave, therefore, to the first class a permanent stake and rule, as they will forever steady the second. That's Hamilton. And so here you see, with Adams in the Oval Office, a so-called stronger sense of government, a strong central government. At the same time here, there are those in England who didn't like the idea that the British government, the British Navy, was still impressing American ships here, going back to 1792, even back to 1793 with Washington. And they were enforcing the Articles of 1756, which were, if anyone's trading with an enemy, they can seize the ships. And that's exactly what they're doing.
Didn't they take the sailors, or some of the
The
sailors?
sailors, but that even comes up before the War of 1812. But you're seeing that here. And that's eventually going to lead to something known as the Jay Treaty. John Jay's Treaty of 1796? I think it's 1796. And 1795-96. And in that treaty, we have to give up a lot. But we get something. We wanted the British to stop seizing American ships. The British, we owe the British a lot of money. A lot of money. from leftover from the colonial days, right? And so the British want us to pay that money back. And also the British have begun building forts in that Ohio River Valley area. Well, in 1787, you had the Northwest Ordinance, where we're going to set those areas up. We're going to set those areas up to be future states. Why do we want the British building forts there? No. In the ensuing negotiations on another thing, the South wants the British to recompense the South for so-called taking their slaves after the American Revolution. Well, guess what? British aren't paying for that. They still want us to pay them back for the money they lost from the Revolution and prior to the Revolution. But at the same time here, Jay does get something here. Jay does get something. The British will remove those forts from that Northwest in the United States. The British will open up their Asian colonies to American shipping. Of course, the British aren't stupid. If they can open up American shipping to their Asian colonies, can't we pay back the British? They're not stupid. They figure this out. They're not stupid. Some think it's a sellout to the British. Washington's not overly happy here, but when that treaty goes through Congress and passes, he'll sign it. He understands that the country needs to come together and build that economy. We can't afford to get ourselves involved in a war in Europe. We can't afford to take on either the British or the French. We have to remain neutral. And you know who understands that too? The Spanish. They see a potential here of an Anglo-American rapprochement here, and maybe that will be a threat to their holdings west of the Mississippi. So you know what they're going to do? Give Americans right to go up and down the Mississippi River and sell their wares going out of New Orleans. The Spanish understand this. They don't speak English. You know, and two English-speaking countries coming together here, that can be a problem. And so while the British will still seize American ships, we're not going to war in Europe. And that kind of lays that background here for what George Washington's going to say when he's no longer president. Avoid entangling alliances because a resulting war could undermine the Republic. Yet, as the revolution proceeds in France, after Adams is president, after 1796, going to 1797, the violence of the French Revolution is far beyond what it was in the United States. And so even those of that Jeffersonian persuasion are turned off by the violence. Yet at the same time here, there are some from France trying to leave France and come here to seek sanctuary. Now, the part of the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Alien Act, when it passes here, instead of waiting 5 years, that 5-year waiting period to become a citizen, it's extended to 14. They don't want French here. It's quite simple. The Federalists don't want the French here because they feel that will be a hotbed of support for the Democrat-Republicans. Interesting here. Interesting the thought process here. Now you're getting an anti-immigrant slant here with the Adams administration. But the real problem here is the Sedition Act. This really runs counter to the First Amendment. And you're going to see this resurrected in 1917-18 when we're in a war. Yet we're not really in a war. There's a potential of going to war with the French. That leads to the quasi-war 1799. But at the same time here, you're telling people they can't criticize the government.
Or the president.
Or the president, right. And so I thought this country was founded on dissent.
And the freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of press.
Freedom of the press, right. And so you can't write anything considered scandalous. You can't write anything and publish it considered insurrectionary. Well, who weighs and measures that? You can't do it. You can be fined. I think it's $5,000, and maybe in prison for 10 years. 10 years, I think it is. Although World War I, it was 20 years. Yeah. And so, interestingly enough, you are seeing assaults against this idea of representative government that many of the founders hold up on an altar, and yet at the same time, some of them at the same time, are now to maintain the party line, the Federalists here are trying to keep the Democrat-Republicans from maybe winning the next election. That's interesting here. That's fascinating to see in this development of party politics, which Washington warned against. Yes, people are people in the end. Well, interesting the point you're making here, because upwards of 100,000 left this country at the end of the American Revolution.
But some didn't.
Some didn't, right. And so some of those people will go to England, but some will go to Canada, become Canadians. And interestingly enough, Alexander Hamilton, a believer in property as a determinant for power, was actually as a lawyer in New York defending people who had Tory or loyalist tendencies, who what's going to be the state of New York, took their land. You're the enemy, we're taking your land. He was defending their right to own land. What does that tell you about Hamilton? You got to give him credit for this. He's putting his money where his mouth is. If we're fighting a revolution to own land, well, that means if we want them as citizens, they have to own land, whether you're Tory or loyalist. Now, that's interesting. That's interesting. Wow. Defending, if you want to use the term, an enemy's right to own land. Because land was considered, the ownership of land was considered that sacred. Now, that's an interesting concept. And so, economic liberty? Yes. Because if you don't own land, what power do you have? Think of it that way. Think of it that way. Of course, back then, only property owners could vote, right? White men who own property. If you were a poor white man in a town, you didn't have property, you could vote? That's going to change. I'll give you, that's going to change. You were a red man, forget blacks voting, they're considered property. And so, and women, can women vote here? No. No. And so but what's Adam saying? The wide ownership of land is a requirement for a functioning system of representative government, but that functioning system of representative government is based on limited suffrage. However, as more and more people are moving west and grabbing land, are you opening up the voter pool here? Yes, you are. Is that going to lead maybe to factions as new states come in? Maybe someone, I can't make it economically here, but I don't like living with these people anyway. I'm going 100, 200 miles west. Does that lead to that factionalism too that perhaps Washington was concerned about? Because again, in his farewell address, interesting what he says, they're referencing the talents of people up north, the talents of people down south, the talents of people of the west, the talents of the people in the east, come together to build the country. That's Washington. That's Washington. But at the same time, when you see the early development of this country, things like the Alien and Sedition Acts, that kind of it does suborn this functioning system of representative government. But then some of these Federalists are thinking, you get French trying to escape that revolution over there, the violence, and come here and own property? Who do you think the Federalists think they're going to vote for in the next election? Democrat Republicans. Democrat Republicans. Now we're thinking maybe along the line, and there are going to be some talented French people coming here, just like there will later be some talented Irish, German, Italian, so on and so forth. I'm sure some of you people are derivatives of that crop that came over here. But at the same time here, is what Washington warned about coming to fruition here. One has to give that idea credence. You're not going to just build a country by reproducing among people who are already here. People are going to be coming here. They're going to be coming. They see this promise of America, but at the same time, there's also an underlying political essence here. Forget parties. How about a functioning system of representative government, or the American Republic? That has to be front and center here. Well, yeah, because as you get more people, okay, whether it's they're reproducing or you're letting more people in, you don't think you're not going to get more variety of opinions, wants, needs, desires, right? And so the original intent of the country, is that going to change? Of course it is. Nothing stays the same forever. It just doesn't work that way. And so maybe, bouncing off what you're saying, maybe what Thomas Jefferson wrote, again, I mentioned this in other talks, that letter of Samuel Kershaw, 1816, that every generation, every 19 or 20 years, the country should have a constitutional convention to acclimate the documents to the present situation. Of course, I think one of the biggest mistakes the founders ever made You know, as they're writing the Constitution, as they're putting together that blueprint for government, they left to me an important mechanism out of that document to arrange the government. The nomination process for candidates to be applied to federal office. They didn't do that. Who does it? The parties. They left this to the parties. And so you don't think what Washington stated about parties being factionalism, you don't think that hasn't prejudiced some of these Democrats and Republicans in offering certain candidates to office? Yes, I'll say yes it has. Yes it has. And so interesting here, what I believe the founders left out. Because after we become a country, then the parties emerge. And Washington, I think, saw all this coming. Now, maybe Washington didn't have quite the talent as a political theorist like Jefferson or Hamilton, but I think by compared to the other two, he was the grown-up in the room. Of course, he's older than they are. I'll give you that, experience. But I think he understood what was going to happen coming down the road here. And I think he was warning us. And so when you see things like the Alien and Sedition Acts, interesting here, is that part of the warnings he's giving us? If you want a functioning republic here, everyone has to have a right to an opinion. Dissent is fine. To me, that's healthy. Why should everyone agree? If you want everyone to agree, if there's going to be a unanimity of opinion, go to a graveyard. They're all dead. There's a unanimity of opinion. But I remember my wife the other day was saying, gee whiz, somebody on her side of the family died. And I said to her, well, are the arrangements made? Yeah, I'm going to be laid out at such and such a mortuary. And I said, which granite garden are they going to?
Oh.
She says to me, she goes, granite garden? I said, yeah. I said, that marble orchard. Which one is he going to?
You're really
You have to
pushing
be
it.
so crass. Well, gotta have a sense. Everything. There's a sense of humor in everything, really. Marble orchard. My oldest son thought, gee, that's great. I gotta remember that one.
Yeah.
So, but there are going to be vast differences of opinion, especially as the population grows, and especially as people move from here to there, and they begin to set up a society or a culture. Even in the same country, there's going to be differences, there's going to be ambiances in society and culture. And maybe how they run their economic agendas here. You don't think that doesn't have it does offer change here. And maybe there are going to be some people in the Midwest who don't see eye to eye with some of us in the East. That's true. How many people you got in this country now? 335 million, round numbers, I guess.
More.
But it went at 3 million. The country has changed here. But then again, when you go back and you read Washington's warnings, and you take a look at things like the Alien and Sedition Acts, and I still say that Jay Treaty, by not at the beginning, not letting us get lost in that great French War in Europe, to me, saved the country. It saved the country. Because if you were going to get into a war like that, then the president is going to have to be given stronger central control. And do you honestly think the country would have developed as it did in the 19th century because of that? We wound up a little bit with egg on our face because we were negotiating from a position of weakness, but we did get some things we need, like the British getting rid of abandoning those forts in the Northwest, allowing us to expand. To me, that's a big one. That's a big one. Again, land. Gives you a political justification for your rights. Yes, part of that was the Monroe Doctrine. Part of that is in response to what, when you had the Congress of Vienna, 1815, and the monarchs are trying to put to bed those ideas of the French Revolution. They don't want those to spread, right? And so they're going to arrange a new balance of power amongst themselves. Spain was left out. Well, why is that? Because Spain had been occupied by the French, and was losing all those territories in Central and South America. Well, how do you resurrect the Spanish monarchy to become a player here? Have an empire? And so in the Congress of Verona, 1822, there was a movement afoot in Europe, especially between the French and the Spanish, to put together a Franco-Spanish army and get those colonies back. Well, what do you think Monroe's going to write in that doctrine? Europeans, stay the heck out of here. We're trying something new, basically a Republican form of government. We don't, the colonies that still exist here, we can't do much about. We don't have the power. But we don't want any new ones here. You know who backs that up? Britain. They don't want their competitors or their neighbors setting up shop here anymore. Interesting here what you're seeing develop. Now, why is that? Because the British are moving into the Middle East, and they're going to be stretched. They don't want to have to come back here to fight the French and the Spanish. And so they will back the Monroe Doctrine. That's actually part of that aftershock, if you want to use that term, the aftermath of the War of 1812. Because of the Treaty of Ghent, when John Quincy Adams, they're going to sign that Treaty of Ghent with the British around Christmas time, 1814, which puts an end to war with Britain. He's going to say, I hope this is the last peace treaty we ever have to sign with Britain. That's the way it's been. Why? Because they didn't fight over land. We never got Canada, and the British didn't take any territory from us. They'll give it back. So it's interesting how land is a determinant for power, and maybe even political settlement, because if you know anything about history, what's one of the major reasons for having another war? One side lost land to the other side, and they want it back.
Right.
You honestly think Ukrainians and Poles, you think Ukrainians don't want part of Poland back? You don't think Poles want part of Ukraine back? We haven't even touched the Middle East yet. There's always, you don't think there aren't some Germans that want East Prussia back? You don't think there are Mexicans that don't want Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, California back? You don't think there are? If you don't think there are, you will find that. So, interesting how land, again, is a determinant for power. Well, that's true, but Spain is a basket case. And they're gonna, Spain's a tragedy here. Napoleon helped kill him when he occupied it in 1808. And so what is Spain going to be doing from that point on until 1936? That results in the end of the what? The Spanish Civil War. And then you're going to see a fascist named Franco finally take control for 40 years. But again, the British are setting up shop in the Middle East because they think that that's where they protect the crown jewel, India, from Russia. And so the politics are changing here, and they're moving away, global politics are moving away from us, and that allows us to spread as a nation. We're going to build this great contiguous empire, is virtually what we're doing here. And your founders used that term. When Washington, again, here we go to Washington, when he's trying to tone down the officers from the potential here of going to Philadelphia and taking control of the government. You're going to deluge our empire. Get the term empire in blood. Empire. And so what we're spreading here, manifest destiny, is this growth of a contiguous empire. But along the way, you're going to see things developing. Part of this is because of parties. Things like the Alien and Sedition Act. You want to keep your opponents quiet. You don't want them to have immigrants come here that could bolster their side. So you raise the waiting period from 5 years to 14 years. Maybe the French Revolution will be over by then. It will be. Of course, it'll degenerate into what? Napoleon. And that's another thing your founders saw too. taking a look at how that popular backlash with the peasantry and the working class reinforced in many of your founders, you can't trust the common man. Wow. Wow. Is that an indictment on you? It sure is. They didn't trust you. They didn't trust you. Of course, if you look at American politics today, maybe they got a leg to stand on here. Maybe they got a leg to stand on here. There's a debate for you. There's a discussion. And I'm sure some people won't like that discussion. But hey, interesting. Fascinating. But then again, that Sedition Act will be resurrected here, really, in 1917, 1918. Only now war has gone to what? It's industrialized war. And so everyone has to be on the same page. This is, for the short time we're in this conflict, 4 million Americans will be in a uniform. 2,084,000 will make it to France. We're not in the war that long. But we are in an industrialized war. And everyone has to be on the same page. Upton Sinclair will be arrested for reading the Bill of Rights in public. That's considered seditious. Really? Yeah, wow is right. Helen, the jungle? Yeah. Helen Keller, ardent socialist. Ardent socialist. Was against the war. Was not a fan of Woodrow Wilson either. And she will support Lenin's revolution in 1917. Of course, was she arrested? That's a stretch. Try arresting Helen Keller. Although, believe it or not, J. Edgar Hoover will eventually have a file on her 54 pages long. I know because I got it home and I've read it. Interesting. Interesting. But she was friends with people like Emma Goldman, John Reed. John Reed, 10 Days That Shook the World. Yeah. Anti-capitalist, pro-worker. I'm going to get deeper into her when I do that series next month. A commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the woman's right to vote. She's going to be one of the two people I'm going to be talking about. Her and Susan B. Anthony. Another feisty lady, if anything. But they're interesting from this perspective of their politics. But, people like, Helen Keller was against the Alien and Sedition Act, or the Sedition Act, 1917, 1918. That's countries founded on dissent. There's a lot more going with her than just overcoming blindness and deafness here. Although that's a great story. I'm not going to undermine that. That's a great, and becoming a world-renowned speaker. Going to at least 25 different countries to give speeches? Wow. A lot of the National Woman's Party in 1917, with, Alice Paul. Oh, and no, not as many people. What was really closed down, who was really attacked were a number of journalists, editors in certain newspapers that were against the Federalists. And because they knew the 1800 election was coming up. And so how do you stifle the competition? Maybe stifle the press? So they don't get their word out?
Correct.
But there were a number of editors who supported the Democrat Republicans who are going to be attacked and marginalized and maybe closed down, that kind of thing. But that's against the First Amendment. How can you be a country that professes consent to the governed and close down free press? I don't know how many of them did. That's a good research question. That's a good research question. But the attempt here to stifle opposing opinion here, that's huge. When you're supposed to have a functioning system of representative government, I thought the free exchange of information here was conducive to a functioning system of representative government. That's what I thought. It's nice to say, I don't agree with what that person says, but in the end, is it worth dying for the ability of that person to render that opinion? Isn't that supposed to be part of a free system? One would think. I don't like what you're saying, but your ability to say it is worth fighting for. That's how I was taught. That's what my father taught me. You know, you might not like what that Bircher is saying, but the ability to render that opinion, okay, that's fine. Render the opinion. We don't have to agree, but who cares? You know, I mean, like I said, I mentioned before, I saw that debate between on YouTube between William F. Buckley and James Baldwin. What a debate! 1965. It was in London, and it was about an hour and a half. And you know, do they agree on everything? Obviously not. But how was the debate? It was a wonderful exercise in political discourse. They came out shaking hands, went out shaking hands, and they went off together. You know, people are cheering. Of course, it's England. They understand the spoken word anyway.
Right.
And well done English language. You know, exercise, whether it's verbal or whether by the pen. But it was an interesting exercise in debate to see that. And so, you know, but that's a free exchange of information. And so was it worth watching? Yeah, it is. It is worth watching. But then again, when you read some of what your founders are writing here, despite the politics going on, the Madison in particular, you know, if people were angels, you wouldn't need a government. He's right, isn't he? You have to have some form of rule to keep people in line, some organization, right? That we call it government. And yet he says, who governs the governed? I think it's in Federalist 38. Who governs the governed? Who governs the government? Well, an obvious notion here is the people. But then again, we know from history, who is a check on the people? So what's going on here? Right. Now we're back to, you know, what came first, chicken or the egg? Right? But that's what Madison is saying. Interesting how they're putting this together. And are there bumps and bruises along the way? Yes, there are. Yes, there are. And do they carry baggage? Yes. They're fallible because they're human. Just like we are. Were they an interesting generation? Most assuredly. Yeah, Washington alluded to the fact that religion is a factor that helps organize society. The problem with that is, and you saw that in France, that's nice that religion helps to keep people on the straight and narrow, but then when you take a look at the clergy, Catholic clergy in France, they were one of the privileged set. I'm not talking about the parish priest. I'm talking about, you know, right, exactly, bishops on up here, who actually had ownership, had about 10-15% of the French countryside. Well, you're getting that with some philosophers of the Age of Reason and Enlightenment. Well, your founders, I think, understood. You know, when you had in 1774 a man by the name of Nathan Fisk running around, he's a cleric, running around in revolutionary Massachusetts telling people to grab a gun and kill the British, how would you like to go to his church on a Sunday? And so the founders, I think, understand, and he's not the only one that was doing this. I think your founders understand we're going to have a revolution, but should it be religiously inspired or inspired by economic liberty? How about economic liberty? And then freedom and rights of an individual. Because if you take a look at history, up to this point, two of the biggest banes for human and civil rights are royalty and religion. Two of the biggest banes. Because theocratic states, do you honestly think theocratic? You know, I think, was it Jefferson? I think it was Jefferson. I have to look it up. He's mentioned along the lines, there has never been a priest-ridden society of any value. Well, there's a stark remark. Yeah. Well, freedom of religion supposedly bolsters this idea of separation of church and state. Freedom of religion, which is going back to what you saw people like Nathan Fisk. You know, the founders are smart enough to see that if you have a cleric running around inspiring people to revolution, well, is there also the alternative agenda maybe that branch of the Protestant sect is looking to take control of the country. I mean, Nathan Fisk and Osama bin Laden, what's the difference? Nathan Fisk probably makes Jerry Falwell look like an altar boy. But he's not the only one. And so this idea of throwing the crown out of here crosses political lines, crosses religious lines, so on and so forth. But then again, there's the agenda. If you have a revolution, is it religiously inspired in certain areas, and will that cause a problem down the road? Well, we're Presbyterians, and we don't want Catholics. You saw that in England in the 17th century. You know, Charles I catering to Catholics, the king, as opposed to many in Parliament who were Presbyterians. How do you think that worked out? That's a problem. That's a problem. We don't want that baggage here. And so, you know, we'll go on from there. But you know, I mean, you know, God forbid, you know, later on you're going to see, you know, Italians coming here, some Spanish, Portuguese, and they're what, Catholic? Oh God, there goes the neighborhood. I remember I asked my father, you know, growing up, what does KKK stand for? He says, well, it's Ku Klux Klan. And I said, what is it? There must be a definition of that. My father said, for some, Catholics, coons, and kikes. Yep. Yeah. That's wrong. That's wrong. Yeah. Yeah, they don't like Jewish people, they don't like Catholics, and they don't like blacks. But then again, I mean, go to some of these websites. Well, you know this, Daily Stormer, Patriot Front. What do you think you're going to read here? The argument can be made they're rawer than the KKK. Of course, you would know that. I mean, you know, in the 20s, the KKK took off the hoods and began to wear suits. So, and these guys, I don't think very many of them are wearing suits. So, when we come back next week, we're going to be doing Flirtation with Dictatorship, Jeff Davis and Abraham Lincoln. And next week I'm going to do Flirtation with Dictatorship. And I like that topic because that really is not addressed too often here. You know, you're in a war like this, the increased power of the presidency. And it's in the South and the North, by the way. And the handout, I spent a bit of time on this one. And you're going to see some things about Lincoln you might be surprised about. And Jeff Davis, too. Although I did that revolt of the planters, and I alluded to Jefferson Davis's growing power. Although, believe it or not, he's not going to be quite as powerful as Lincoln. And so, and some of that has to do with industrialization. Who's more industrialized? The North. Interesting where you take a look at the Civil War from that aspect, industrialization, technology, and money, and then where it goes to 1914, and then where it goes to 1939. And you see a progression here. Fascinating to see. As the Industrial Revolution gains steam, technology, capitalism, money. Interesting how it changes your politics, changes war, changes society. Fascinating. Yes. Well, and also true, you had, not that this wasn't up north here, it was, but in the South, individualism was huge.
Good.
Was huge. And so there are going to be desertions up north. You know that, but there's going to be a lot of desertions in the Southern Army. You know, and some of these guys will go back to the mountains, try finding them. You know, that's tough. That's tough. And so you're going to see this thing with the South as it becomes more of a strong central government, which is not what states' rights was about. And so does that accentuate the power of the president? Yes, it will. You'll see the same sort of thing up north, too. So, but that's for next week. Otherwise, have yourselves a good evening.